Well, I do want to extend a really warm welcome to all of you who are here joining us for the third of the UMsConnected Conversations, as we've styled them. We've had two really exciting events leading up to this one. Our last conversations was with Ken Carter, who was somewhat the brain and heart behind the launch of UMsConnected, and had a really stimulating evening with him. And we look forward to this evening looking at kind of a particular theme. And I'm really happy to be hosting this event for this evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Paul Chilcote, and I'm retired now from the United Methodist Ministry and a career in theological education, spanning a lot of different parts of the globe, in fact. But I'm really excited to share this evening with you and all that lies ahead. Our two guests for this evening are Steve West, who is the author of a fairly new book entitled Something Happens Here. And that will be kind of the springboard that launches us into a larger conversation of the centrality of the Eucharist in Wesleyan spiritual formation. And to help us with that conversation is a very good friend of Steve's, Don Saliers, and a name I'm sure known by many of you who are on screen with us here this evening. So let me go ahead and give you a little bit of a blueprint for the evening. It's a very simple one. Nice thing about an hour is it divides very neatly into 4 quarters. So the first quarter of this hour is going to essentially be a conversation that I have with Steve about the book and what he wants to share with us regarding it. I have a number of questions to kind of tease out some of that, but look forward to that conversation. And then Don Saliers actually wrote the foreword to this book. And then I'll have an ongoing conversation with Don as well for 10 or 15 minutes or so, perhaps. And then the three of us, Steve, Don, and myself, will have some ongoing conversation, perhaps broadening the themes we're thinking about together to its broadest application of the centrality of Eucharist in our tradition and in spiritual formation. And then the final quarter of the hour will open up the floor, kind of gallery view conversation with all three of us and with one another as we kind of seek to plumb the depths of such a huge theme together. So I'm just so excited about the evening. I've been looking forward to it for a long time. So let me give you a really quick introduction to Steve West, who is the author of that book, Something Happens Here. Steve is a pastor in the North Alabama Conference and currently serving, I think you've been a couple of years at least, at Jacksonville, and has a background from Birmingham Southern College as a graduate of Candler School of Theology, and did his doctoral work at Sewanee. We first met at a 5-day spiritual academy where Steve and I served together on the leadership team for that event. But Steve also has a strong avocation, I guess I would call it, in music as a vocalist, a pianist, an instrumentalist. So he brings a lot of pastoral experience, those connections with liturgy and music to the topic for this evening. So Steve, thank you so much for joining us and being a part of this evening with us. And
my honor.
Let me just give you a couple easy pitches, no curveballs, as I offer a question or two to help get us started. This is a great book. Something Happens Here, that is in a very interesting series. And I hope that if you haven't read it, that many of you will pick up a copy of that book, even right away after this session, and put that on a reading table somewhere so you can work your way through it. It's an easy read, but it's a lot of depth here with regard to the theme. So what launched the project, Steve? What's the backstory to this book?
Well, thank you, Paul, and I'm so honored to be here. The backstory is that as a gift to myself during starting about 2015, I went back to Swanee to do my doctoral work, which happens to be a time period in United Methodism that has been most interesting over the past 7 years. I already had a love for music and liturgy and a love for the Eucharist, chose Sewanee on purpose, as well as the fact that that's ancestral stomping grounds for my family up in Tennessee. But what converged for me was what I consider truly a work of practical theology, because here we are in the midst of dramatic changes, divisive issues in our country, as well as divisive issues in the United Methodist Church. And what came to me, starting with some conversations I had with Dr. Saliers, who is also my project professor for this thesis, for this doctoral work, during one of those early classes was, how can the table be what we come back to in order to move forward? And that just became the phrase for me, the gripping phrase for me, that perhaps we need to come back to the table in order to move forward in times when there's a lot of uncertainty about what it means to move forward. And so that became a practical theology project, and it couldn't be more practical, in my humble opinion, with what's going on. It also led me to an additional avocation of starting an organization here in the North Alabama Conference called Stay UMC, which has gotten some national attention for being involved in. So I'm a pastor slash musician slash theologian, and in more recent days, politically active in the United Methodist Church. So that wasn't my nature before all this started, but I was just compelled by what I was learning.
Wow. Yeah, when I, in the teaching that I've done with regard to Wesleyan theology, and in my own experience in the life of the church, I've found that a lot of the understanding of Holy Communion or the Lord's Supper or Eucharist, basic understanding was pretty monochromatic. In other words, what kind of one-dimensional. And so I was really taken by this image of the prism, which really frames the entire book. So can you tell us a little bit more about that prism image that you use?
Yes, and I will claim responsibility for that image. But as I read, beginning with reading 1 Corinthians, the last several chapters 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, it occurred to me in my studies over a long period of many years that communion for Paul, the Eucharist for Paul, became a prism by which he was looking at and understanding what was going on in the community. So one way to think of those last chapters is that he saw communion at the table, the abuses toward one another that were happening at the table in 1 Corinthians 11, which was well known to us. And then he began to see that as a prism through which he began to see the other things going on in the community and the need to teach about spiritual gifts and about the centrality of love. And I began to discover that these chapters were actually strung together with his own connecting material, as if it all emerged from that chapter 11. Then I began to see that in a similar way, Wesley in his time saw communion as a prism through which he began to understand what his ministry was all about, in different issues, different times, different discoveries. But communion became a way that he began to both see and experience some of his landmark doctrinal teachings, such as sanctification, the whole tradition of the love feast and the koinonia and the fellowship,
Mhm.
being perfected in love, which I discovered he didn't invent the concept of Christian perfection. He borrowed that from an ancient person. So then I thought we need to do the same thing. In this time, our issues are great in God's church as we move forward. It's different sets of social issues and things going on, but could communion not be what brings us back together, not in a sense of going backwards, but in a sense of going forward with greater vision? Because that's who we really are. And who we are called to be at the same time. We are the communion of Christ, and yet we are not completely lived into that reality at the same time. There's the eschatological theme of the table. We are always becoming the body of Christ that we claim to partake of, and that God calls us as well. So that's where that theme
Yeah.
of the prison came to me.
Yeah, you just mentioned sanctification and Christian perfection, and you deal with a number of these really critical themes in Wesleyan theology, in particular, remembrance, sanctification, and community, and drawing on sources, the sources that stand behind Wesley's appreciation of those. I've often, using the 1745 hymns on the Lord's Supper that you reference and refer to frequently here. I find dimensions of time there as well that align really nicely with this remembrance, sanctification, community kind of typology that you play with. So the past, the present, the future. I even like to link the kind of sacramental language with each of those, with the Lord's Supper as the past, the Eucharist, Eucharistia, Thanksgiving as the present, communion, Holy Communion as the future. I was really drawn by the way in which your themes of remembrance, sanctification, community align with those kind of time dimensions that I instinctively saw in the hymns as well. Can you say a little bit more about those central themes of remembrance, sanctification, and community?
I can, and I would add, of course, from my book, but I would add the theme of presence, and presence, remembrance, sanctification, and communion, or koinonia, to be more specific. I discovered that those, in my analysis of Wesley's teachings, both through Charles's hymns, John Wesley's, him editing and compiling, and of course his sermons and his various writings that we have, including his notes on scripture, that those were, I'd say, four pillars of his distinctive teachings regarding Eucharist. And you mentioned ancient sources. One of the things I discovered is in each case, one can identify some influencing factors that Wesley borrowed from in the most creative of ways in his quest to reclaim primitive Christianity. He called it primitive Christianity. So there's a historical analysis in each chapter. So yes, I think of those as four really central features of the distinctiveness of Wesleyan spirituality. And this is another catchphrase that I use in my book, but we're seeking to reclaim the distinctiveness of Wesley's communion spirituality for our times of divisiveness. And I stick with that a lot.
Yeah. You probably wouldn't guess what my favorite statement was in the book. It's one of those that I underlined several times, and it's so simple. Maybe that's the way I love it so much. On page 107, you say, "It's not just about me and Jesus." with regard to the sacrament. This sign act of love in which we're participating. It's not just about me and Jesus. Can you unpack that a little bit too for the participants here this evening?
Sure. And actually, that's in the context of telling a story of my very first Sunday in my very first church, which was 33 years ago now, in which a person remarked, what I love about communion is it's just me and Jesus. It's just me and Jesus. And a part of me my heart was warmed because it was so personal for her. And a part of me, a question mark came up in my brain. That doesn't quite sound right. There's something that's not right. It's not just me and Jesus. And so in some ways, that moment on my first day of my first church and my first time to ever be a celebrant was a defining question for the rest of my ministry, because it's never just about me and Jesus. We are part of we are called to be a part of the kingdom of God, which is bigger than me. So thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's probably a good time to bring Don into the conversation. You've been sitting there patiently, Don, and listening to all of this. Don Saliers is a name that is probably familiar to virtually everyone here on the screen, especially as we think about the theme for this evening of Eucharist, the centrality of Eucharist in Wesleyan spiritual formation. William Cannon, Distinguished Professor of Theology and Worship at Candler School of Theology, Emory University. Currently now in a good many years in retirement, Don, as I look at the dates, but now theologian in residence there at Candler. Many of you, maybe even Candler graduates on the screen, will remember Don as director of the sacred music program there, organist, choir master of Cannon Chapel. There are few people that I know of, and I mean this in a way to honor you, Don. There are a few people that I know of who have the kind of longevity in the life of the church and have witnessed multiple changes in worship, some of which are directly related to our theology and practice of the sacrament of Holy Communion. So I want to, it's kind of a soft way perhaps, but I think a deep way to bring you into the conversation is simply to ask, and I think you started at Candler in 1974.
That's correct.
Yeah, 1970. So, I mean, I almost hate to say it, but we're coming close to a half century, a half century of engagement in worship and liturgy in the life of the United Methodist Church. What are the changes that you've witnessed that are that resonate with this conversation we're having, specifically with regard to our theology and practice of the Lord's Supper?
Well, one of the great high points of my whole life as a Christian was when we published the Rite in 1972, the new Rite for Holy Communion or Eucharist. So I was at work first in 1968. Now, some of you may remember that actually was a date, and I was there. And so I was asked to be part of the composition of new liturgical materials for this new church, United Methodist Church. So I worked very hard with some really wonderful people, Hoyt Hickman, Jim White, Larry Stuckey, and a whole host of lay people that were involved in the drawing up of baptismal rites, marriage, ordination, death and resurrection. Probably one of the best things we did was the service for death and resurrection, and of course the Eucharist itself. So my history has been to observe what we accomplished and what then the history of those rites have been. And it's, I have to confess to you before all of you, my sisters and brothers, that it's a bit of a checkered history at the realm of practice. Many, many churches received that with glad and welcoming hearts, but the culture didn't stay the same. We received those rites, say between 1970 and 72, 76 was the baptismal rite, at a time when we felt that they were really producing some kind of new thing with us. But the culture didn't stay steady. And so at the realm of the practice of what we have in our book of worship, it's been a much more difficult and complex story, as all of you can attest. But so part of my work since then has been to continue the kind of vision of a Eucharistic community, a word experiential community, a baptismal community that the Wesleys would recognize. And so that's why my continuing work with Wesleyan sources it's been such a joy to receive Steve's book, because it's a wonderful way in which his own pastoral experience and stories on the ground by real people struggling animate the history and the development of where we are. Now, by saying that we have a kind of a checkered history, I do not at all mean to say that there hasn't been a profound impact on our practice as United Methodists. And that's part of the joy that I can report, and that many of you can report too, that we're in a very different place now with respect to our theological understanding of Eucharist than we were, say, in 1950, or even in 1967 or 68. And partly that is brought out beautifully by Steve, I have to say to you. But also there are other colleagues here like Greg Clapper who knows this. And Steve Harper, dear Steve, I'm just delighted to see you, even if it's only over the camera, because your own work at the conjunction of worship and the spiritual life of the church, and Paul, your work, and all of you on this, in this seminar tonight, know what I mean. There's a great gift has been given to us by way of a large, more ecumenical recovery that has Wesleyan distinctives in it. But it's also a task. So that's an opening. I just want to say that to think that taking the bread and the cup prayerfully, we take in the whole hurt and suffering of the world, and at the same time, we signify and enact the divine promise and reality. As you say, it's a sign and a means. This is so distinctively Wesleyan. Though I love it when Wesley was asked, well, sir, what is the, how would you define the difference between a Methodist and a Christian? And Wesley is reported to have said, well, sir, I do not think there is any difference between a faithful Christian and a faithful Methodist. I love that. I think that's borne out in Steve's wonderful book, and in a lot of the work that all of us on this conversation are having.
Yeah, I remember, I grew up in a Methodist parsonage, and as a PK, remember as a youth, quarterly celebrations of the sacrament. That was my father's generation. But we've seen a lot of revolution in terms of that aspect of practice. The church that we are now a part of here in the Orlando area has weekly communion. And that's not something on the side of the life of the church for the super pious. That is the main service of worship every Sunday is word and table. And when I think of in the course of one generation, that kind of change happening in the life of United Methodist communities, that's pretty astronomical, isn't it?
I do not take that for granted. And I sometimes begin to weep over the recovery and the gift that has been given to us. It's the business about, and do we use the means given to us? And this was Wesley, both John and Chuck, I may say so, they realized they were in a church that didn't realize the huge power in the means that had been given to them. And so in that sense, I think we can celebrate what we have been given and what has been fostered. I think a lot of this, maybe we'll come back to this as other people ask questions, and I know it's implicit in Steve's book, but we need a lot more catechesis, faithful, experiential catechesis. It's a fancy way of saying we need to know what it is that has been given to us, scripture, tradition, and again, I think Steve's book really is an excellent starting point or continuing point in that task.
Yeah. Are there any particular aspects of the book, Don, that you would want to elevate or kind of bring into focus for us?
Yes. When you're asked a question like this, you immediately think, are there 7 things I want to say? Are there 3? So just let me fire some of the things that really have impressed me. One is a wonderful use of Charles Wesley's hymn texts. And I think we neglect that the sung theology of the church, and in some of the new composers that are taking those texts and setting them, and some tunes that we've always sung to, and setting them to very accessible new arrangements of it. I think of Antonio Alonso's new revival. I think of a lot of composers working. So first of all, Steve uses, and wisely, a whole range of Charles Wesley's texts to do theological work. And I could cite a few of them. I think one of my favorites, of course, is "Oh, the depth of love divine," or "O thou who in this mysterious bread." Now, the language is 18th century. It owes a lot more to George Herbert than it does to Bob Dylan. But it's worth knowing that that language is sustainable and still can work its way. So that's the first point. Charles Wesley's hymns as theological anchor points for the distinctives. The other thing that I love about it is the way in which he uses actual stories in parish life. I think of the chapter where Sarah Miles shows up, and all the work she did on bread lines, and a number of people in actual churches where the pastoral reality of Eucharist comes through in the development of life. So that's a second distinctive. The other thing, of course, is the way in which there's a skillful use of a lot of the historical background, like Macarius, for example. That's a very distinctive chapter. I'm looking at West. He's just studying. He's just sitting there. Steve, I think that was a wonderful gift you've given us. To a lot of people are maybe for the first time realizing that Wesley had his patristics in mind. He was not confined to the jolly old island of England. He knew the larger tradition. So I like the way in which you've used historical sourcings and made them very accessible here. And of course, there is running through the whole thing, maybe my favorite topic, some of you might say, eschatological. The fact, when I first came to Cantor, I had these debates with Bishop Harmon. Any of you, I don't know you know that name or not, but Bishop was in his late 80s and early 90s. And our first conversation about the Lord's Supper, he reminded me that the Lord's Supper was like a funeral for Jesus. And if we ever lose that, we'll lose it all. And I bit my tongue and stayed silent for quite a while. But suddenly now, here, I think running through the whole of this book, but especially in a couple of the chapters, the eschatological force. This is a resurrection meal. It doesn't deny that there was suffering and that there is a cross. What it does is reorient. This is a meal for the whole cosmos. This is a resurrection meal. Paul, you were saying many, many dimensions.
Mhm.
And that's why the prism image works so beautifully. And I think here of the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, who speaks of the immortal diamond that is Christ. And so you turn the immortal diamond. And I had that in mind when I read the prism image, that there are flashes of the marvelous eschatological promise and action of God as we turn the prism of the Lord's Supper. So those are maybe four strengths.
Well, why don't we bring Steve into the conversation, have kind of a three-way kind of panel conversation as we move forward. So got the three of us spotlighted here. And one of the things I wanted to make sure we talked about, and this might be the good segue into this conversation, is this language related to the book of reclaiming the distinctiveness of Wesley's communion spirituality in times of divisiveness. This is what UMsConnected in many ways is all about, is visioning the future, a future that is inclusive, that is a community of wide embrace, a lot of different language we can use about the vision of the United Methodist Church of the future. But how do you, Steve and Don, how do you think about the importance of the sacrament in terms of this age of divisiveness in which we live? What does it offer to us? What is the gift that is offered to us in this sign act of love?
Well, I would first respond to use some language from John Philip Newell, that it is rediscovering or reclaiming some of our most central identity. You know, it's the Eucharist is not something we do; it is who we are. I mean, it is wrapped up in who we are, and that essence, the immortal diamond, as Don just said it, in times when you really need to rediscover who you are, it seems like this is where one key place we would go is that. In other words, what Philip Newell said, and I say this in the book, that which is deepest within us is where you start. And I believe that. I believe that the table and what we experience anew in the table is that which is deepest within us.
And there's a huge, large cosmic sense we could talk about, but I love to start at the domestic level. Think of the kitchen table. Think of the conversations. I just finished an essay on practicing parenthood. And one of the practices that my family did, and that all of your families have probably done, is trying to preserve table time and table talk. We meet at the table in a very different level than when we meet elsewhere. First of all, we are sustained by a meal. I mean, the whole notion of gathering about a meal of sustenance is so primal, so primordial. And then if you come to the table and Jesus is there, well, then wait a minute here. That should be a very radical notion. So it's lots of times I like to start, and that's why, again, Steve, like your stories, our pastoral reality. I served a very small rural church in Ohio that had a wandering dog that came in and sometimes prayed at the altar. But we celebrated dutifully, quarterly. And many of the memories that people had and I have had of that place were around the table. as
Mhm.
simple as it was, and maybe our theology wasn't quite adequate to the mystery, but we did it. And they do remember those times. Or in an inner city church that I served for some time that was struggling with racial issues in the 60s. And it was that table that taught us to respect our differences and bring our differences. I remember the first time that we had pita bread or tortilla bread, because we didn't go get the Wonder Bread at Publix, or actually someone brought this, and it was a great gift to us to begin to see what people were perceiving in one another there. Then, of course, those of us who've had the privilege of being in grand churches, in cathedral spaces, realize that there's something about that same humble meal that comes to us, especially for me, being a Benedictine oblate, when I'm at St. John's Abbey, and the Eucharist is celebrated there in this magnificent long tradition. I have that same encounter, the intimacy and the glory together.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I love to start with the idea that people need to eat, and we need to greet, and we need to be with each other, and we need to share not only bread, but our life. And so my 4 daughters, I talked about the practices that we had at Sunday meal, which became after a while not only a meal, but a theological forum. And some of you know one of my daughter's music, the Indigo Girls, Emily. And I think a lot of her deep and profound commitment to social justice came out of communion and out of our discussions about what does it mean. So one of the big
Oh, I
topics,
believe that. Sure.
yeah, one of the topics amongst those my daughters was time and time again. It started with simple children's questions about fairness, and then they were allowed to ask anything they wanted at that meal, and devolved eventually into the fact that they became so enormously sensitive to the question of human suffering. Here we were celebrating after Eucharist the question of the world's suffering, and what had we just had at the altar table that was now permeating our relationships with each other. So that's another factor, just the sheer phenomenology of having a meal, a time and a place, transformative.
I remember when I was in pastoral ministry in North Indiana, and I was making an effort to move the congregation to a more regular celebration of communion, with a goal being the regular, ordinary, normal service of worship there. And there was a little boy who came forward to receive with his family. And I think he must have been, maybe about 4 years of age or so. And there, the tradition was you all came forward, you knelt at the chancel, and then there was a table dismissal. You would get up and start back to your pew. And as he went back the central pew, he stuck out his tummy and was rubbing his stomach. And he said, "Oh, now I am full."
Oh, wow.
And I thought, what a profound, children teach us so much.
Oh, yeah.
What a profound theological insight. And as you said, Don, I think one of the things that makes this a uniting experience is that we all come with the same need. And it's so basic. It's hunger. All of us are hungry. And we come to the table with this hunger. And God, like that little boy knew, fills us up, and then sends us out into the world from the table into mission, in witness and service to the world. Profound experiences. Is there anything, before we kind of open up the space for some larger dialogue and Q&A, anything else, Don or Steve, that you'd want to share as you think about the centrality of the Eucharist in our tradition and the issue of unity, particularly at this divisive time?
I would just add that one of the things I discovered about Wesley's teaching is, to put it simply, we come together not in remembrance of us, we come in remembrance of Christ. I know that sounds so simple, but I think that in times of divisiveness, we are more concerned about ourselves and each other than what it is that draws us together, which is the table of grace and the grace that we experience and that it represents. I just wanted to add that we don't come in remembrance of us or our differences, or even in remembrance of what do we agree on. We come in remembrance of a person, all of who Christ is, was, and shall be.
Yeah, I think of the fact that every once in a while, it dawns on us at the Eucharistic celebration that we are being remembered by God.
Yes.
And you know, we all have played, I think, around the etymology of remembering, putting back together, being remembered, being put our members back together. But all of us have seen amazing reconciliation happen at a meal. We've seen amazing fisticuffs too. But one of the great experiences in our life here in where I've taught, of course, has been the appearance of Archbishop Tutu.
Mhm.
And I remember the first time that he celebrated Eucharist in our chapel, and we realized that something was happening here that was well beyond our psychology or any kind of explanatory note, because he brought his life that was so dedicated and so receptive to God in his innocent, remarkable way. And there was nothing else to do except say, God was here and remembers us in all of our diversity. So for me, in a time where we're at each other's throat, and the other factor here that we may want to discuss is that we live in a culture that doesn't recognize the power that is given to us in Eucharist. And that gets back to the 3 points you make at the very end of the book about the consumerism and functionalism.
Yes.
And an odd concept of freedom, like freedom from restraint. We don't have to do anything. All right, show me a family that doesn't remember its death days or its wedding days or its birthdays, and I'll show you a dysfunctional family. So what we're really talking about is the meal over time, the encounter over time. Keeping time with Jesus is the most important thing we can possibly do. And as far as I'm concerned, he's always surprising us. We thought, we're the same old words. Now look at the pastoral level. If the Holy Communion is perceived by members as a bunch of words we say,
Right,
then we're in trouble. Because it's there may be words, thank God, and there are words of prayer, thank God, but the fundamental thing is nonverbal. It's this encounter,
Right?
music. It's this grace. I love the chapter 6 title, Grand Channel of Grace. Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
and of course I didn't make that up. That's a quote from Wesley.
I know. And another Wesley thing that I found in rummaging through some of Charles's hymns is this wonderful phrase, we are to be transcriptions of the Trinity. How about that? Transcriptions of the Trinity. Are you kidding, Charles?
He's I've done a lot of research done on that phrase, a transcription of the Trinity. And I've looked through a lot of theological sources, ancient to modern, and I don't find that phrase used with regard to what I would describe as authentic Christianity or authentic discipleship in any other theologian of the church. I think it's absolutely unique to Charles Wesley. But I wanted to pick up something that you said earlier. You mentioned tutu, and then talked about the way in which God surprises us. And that triggered in my mind a story by Peter Story that many of you have heard before, I'm sure, where he visited an imprisoned African, Ike Molawabi on Robbins Island, when he was chaplain to the island, to the prison, and on this occasion took the elements of Holy Communion to share communion with Ike Molawabi. And at that time, you could not visit anyone in that prison without an Afrikaner prison guard in the cell with you. So Peter tells how when the visit was coming to its close and he was getting ready to celebrate communion, he said an idea popped into my mind to invite the prison guard to share with us in communion. And he said to his utter astonishment, he agreed. He said, so here were the three of us, this white Afrikaner prison guard, black South African, and me. So then we came to the distribution, and I gave them the bread. They shared around the circle. And then I came to the cup, and I gave it to Ike first, not thinking. And then it dawned on me, for this Afrikaner prison guard to receive the cup, he'll have to drink from a cup that this black South African had just drunk from. And he said, and he did. And Peter's point in the story is, in that moment, the reign of God broke in on us, surprised by the reign of God. And it may have been momentary, but it was a glimpse. It was an inkling. It was a moment in time that became eternal. This is the power of the sacrament, I believe. And that's the eschatological dimension, isn't it, Don? But before we run out of time, let's open up the screen to everyone and see what questions or observations or reflections you have on this theme of the centrality of Eucharist in Wesleyan spiritual formation. I think, Allison, you could probably just put us on gallery view. I don't think there are too many. We can probably all fit on one screen, which is great. And let's see what kind of questions arise. I'll just try and monitor these. I think with the numbers we have, it's just as easy to do it that way. So I'll simply ask you if you want to ask a question or make a point or make an observation or tell a story. Simply raise your hand, or the easiest just to unmute yourself and begin to speak. I think we can navigate it well enough that way.
Paul, I have a question.
Yeah, sure. Allison, I think you could probably take us off spotlight so all of us can see everyone.
Is that Gary?
Yes.
Okay. Mhm.
Go ahead.
Good to see you again, Don. It's been a number of years since we were at the academy together, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Paul this summer in England. The question I have is, I grew up at that era where communion was quarterly. And when I went to seminary in the late 70s, it was just starting to become a regular thing on a monthly basis to the point that now, of course, it's, sacramental to do it on the first Sunday of the month. And I appreciate those churches that do it more regularly. But my question is, if Wesley took it regularly, how did we get to the point that it was only quarterly and not more regular than that?
I have a very simple question. It's called the American frontier.
Yeah.
And I also like to quote T.S. Eliot. Humankind can't stand that much reality. But I think the American frontier took it away, and for geographical and very practical, functional reasons.
I agree wholeheartedly. I'd add to that, too, that on the American frontier, with a lack of ordained clergy, for example, that were able to celebrate the sacrament, and then with the rise of the camp meeting in the American frontier, there was an easy solution to the problem in the utilization of the love feast, which was a non-sacramental act, but felt a lot like sacrament to people. So in some ways, the love feast displaced the regular celebration of communion in the American scene. Great question, Gary. Yeah, Tess, go ahead.
I want to thank this. I am a friend refers to me as a Roman Methodist. I would love to have communion every day. My pastor, at one time we had two services. One service had communion every Sunday, and the other one was more contemporary. Didn't have enough people for the traditional service. She keeps only doing once a month. And I said, can we do it twice a month? And I am going to take the tape of this, and I am going to email it to her. And I am going to take a copy of the book title and email that to her. And I possibly will use lay speaker prerogative and not follow the lectionary and preach on why we need to have communion every Sunday. Because I keep wanting to tell her it's a learning experience for the rest of the congregation. We live in a very, it's a small town, not small town, it's a middle-sized town about 30 miles south of Seattle. And no, it's just, so yes, I'm going to use this to get up on my high horse so I'll be a better target. So thank you.
Yes, of course, you do raise the other question that's been implicit occasionally in what we've been saying, and that is, if the image of the Lord's Supper is functional, or it's something to be done, or it's, we do it out of obedience and so on, and it's essentially reading words out of a book, then no wonder people are not going to get too enthusiastic about it.
Right.
Right.
But if it's our very life, if it raises for us again and again the question of whose we are and what are the questions of life and death and justice and goodness and beauty, if it carries that, then people are going to want to have.
I keep telling her it's a perfect time for education.
Yeah,
it is.
In that same church test where I was trying to develop a greater sensitivity to communion, a woman in the context of that, one of the women of the church came to me and said, Paul, would it be all right if I baked the bread for communion? And I said, oh my goodness, that would be fantastic. Little did I know that her plan was to bake the bread in the kitchen at the church on Sunday morning. So the kitchen was literally directly beneath the sanctuary. So as people came to church on that Sunday morning, the aroma of this freshly baked bread pervaded the whole place. People going, whoa, does that smell good? And that in and of itself, I think, went such a long way to convince people this is good. This is exciting. This is feeding us. You see, it brings all of those images, as Don was saying, of meal, of being hungry and being fed. All that becomes real because you've got another sense involved in all of it.
And this is a family supper. So thank you again.
Yeah, Christabel.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on what Tess has said about the frequency of Holy Communion. Sometimes we hear it said that we don't want it so often because, familiarity breeds contempt and it's no longer special, and, people will just not appreciate it so much. So how do you respond to that?
Oh, that's a good question. Protestants are very quick to say, I don't want dead ritual. And there are a lot of Methodists, we don't want dead ritual and so on. Well, I've got some questions to ask about their social life. Some of them may
Right.
be embarrassing to some of us, but is lovemaking something that really doesn't require persistence and okay, all right, I've got the big one out. After that, we go back to the notion of nourishment and encounter, and what is the most distinctive process of encountering Jesus, except where he has promised to be with two or three of us in word and in sacrament. And I mean, of course, we can encounter Jesus anywhere, although I'm beginning to fade on the golf course argument. I think it's weak, but anyway, it's a wonderful way to put it, and I thank you for raising that question, because sometimes we use this business of we don't want empty ritual, and we've got to look at the way we live our lives. Our children will teach us about good ritual if we let them.
And it's important to add that John Wesley actually addresses that very question in a sermon on the duty of constant communion.
Absolutely, he does.
Take a look at that. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you, Steve.
Well, actually, would you believe I was going to mention that sermon?
Oh, sorry.
But yes, absolutely, because I talk about that in one of the chapters. But I would add that frequency is not the only way to enliven the sacrament in your local church. That is one way, but that's not the only way. And I think that it feels like a dead ritual because it's treated like a dead ritual, with little education, with little experience, with little, and so there are lots of ways, depending on the local church setting. Even though I would love to do communion every single week, there are lots of ways to enliven the experience and make it fresh. You mentioned fresh baked bread, having lay people to serve and learning how to do that, and wrapping that into the experience. For me, memorizing the liturgy. Now, not everybody feels comfortable with that, but for me, that's part that something I've done, and stand behind the table and inviting the congregation to join with me at the table. Things like that can really bring the fullness of the experience together. Music, how that's dealt with.
Singing, I think now for some of us, bicultural singing,
yes,
is just a huge influence on people. I love it when we can sing in Espanol, in English, or in whatever. So yeah, many ways in.
Whenever I want to have a Eucharistic service that's focuses joy, I always make it African. Because the African church is a singing and dancing church. And I have too many stories to share about that for this evening. And any of you who know me and have worked with me know that I absolutely hate time. One of the things I look forward to in heaven is no time. This wouldn't have to end. But it's 8 o'clock, and this has been such a fabulous conversation. So I want to thank Steve West for being here this evening, and for your book. Something happens here, just in the same way that something has happened here this evening. So thank you so much for that, Steve. And Don, such a joy to be with you, and thank you for your participation as well in this. With regard to the UMsConnected Conversations, this is the third. There will not be one in December, but stay tuned to our Facebook page or our website, and you'll find information about future events there. But let me simply take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you for participating this evening and for engaging in such important and exciting conversations together. So God bless you as you gather around your own Thanksgiving tables in just a few weeks. Bring to mind all of the potential connections with the table of the Lord's Supper. Because whatever happens around those family tables carries all of that same meaning and power into our celebration of Holy Communion. So thank you so much. Have a blessed Thanksgiving, and I hope that we'll see you down the road at some time.